The autumn evening wrapped around Thomas Bennett's two-story suburban home like a thick blanket. At 45, Thomas had built what many would consider a comfortable life. A successful career as a software developer, a beautiful home in a peaceful neighborhood, and 15 years of marriage to Sarah, who he'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue. That night, Thomas sat in his home office, finishing up some late work as he often did. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of his computer and the occasional creak of the old hardwood floors. Sarah had mentioned she was going to bed early, complaining of a headache after a long day at her real estate office. Around 11:30 p.m., Thomas decided to get a glass of water before turning in himself. As he walked down the carpeted hallway, he heard Sarah's voice drifting from their bedroom. She was speaking in hushed tones, obviously on the phone with someone. Thomas wouldn't normally have paid much attention to his wife's late-night conversations. She often spoke with her sister Claire about family matters. But something in Sarah's tone made him pause outside the door, which was slightly ajar. "Yes, I understand completely," Sarah was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to handle this carefully. Once it's done, everything will be ours." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear more. "I know it seems rushed, but we can't wait any longer," Sarah continued. "The paperwork needs to be finalized this week. I've already spoken to the lawyer." A cold sensation spread through Thomas's chest. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. In 15 years of marriage, he'd never had reason to doubt Sarah. She'd always been loving, supportive, and honest. At least, that's what he believed until now. "The sooner we get this done, the better," Sarah said to the person on the other end of the line. "I'll make all the arrangements. Just make sure you're available on Thursday for the meeting." Thomas's legs felt weak. Thursday, that was the day he was planning to go on his annual solo fishing trip. He'd been looking forward to it for months, had even bought a new fishing rod for the occasion. Now the timing seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. The conversation continued, but Sarah's voice dropped even lower, and Thomas could only catch fragments. "The accounts. Transfer everything. No one needs to know yet." He backed away from the door as quietly as possible, his socks silent against the carpet. When he reached his office, he closed the door and sank into his chair, his mind whirling with what he'd just heard. Thomas opened his laptop and began searching through their shared accounts and documents. Everything seemed normal on the surface: their joint checking account, savings, investment portfolio. But what if Sarah had accounts he didn't know about? What if she'd been planning something behind his back all this time? He thought about their life together, the morning coffee they shared on their back porch, the weekend trips to the farmer's market, the way Sarah always remembered to buy his favorite brand of potato chips. Had it all been an act? The thought made his stomach churn. Their wedding photo sat on his desk, taken 15 years ago on a bright spring day. Sarah was laughing in the picture, her white dress catching the sunlight, while Thomas looked at her with absolute adoration. He picked up the frame, studying Sarah's face as if it might reveal some hidden truth he'd missed all these years. As midnight approached, Thomas heard Sarah's footsteps in the hallway. He quickly closed all the browser tabs and pretended to be engrossed in work when she poked her head in. "Still working, honey?" she asked, smiling warmly. "Don't stay up too late. You know how grumpy you get without enough sleep." "Just finishing up," Thomas replied, amazed at how steady his voice sounded despite his churning emotions. "I'll be there soon." Sarah blew him a kiss and disappeared down the hallway. Thomas sat in his dark office, listening to her footsteps fade away. The man who had entered this room just hours ago, trusting, content, secure in his marriage, was gone. In his place sat someone else, suspicious, afraid, and completely uncertain about what to do next. As the clock struck midnight, Thomas Bennett made a decision that would change everything. If Sarah was planning something, he needed to find out what it was, no matter the cost. Thomas spent the entire night tossing and turning, his mind racing with possibilities. He told Sarah he needed to finish some urgent work and would sleep in the guest room to avoid disturbing her. In reality, he couldn't bear to lie next to her, pretending everything was normal. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Thomas had already formed a plan. He picked up his phone and called the one person he knew he could trust: Michael Rodriguez, his best friend since college. Michael had been there for every major moment in Thomas's life, including being the best man at his wedding. You need to come over right now, Thomas said when Michael answered. And don't tell anyone you're meeting me. Michael arrived 30 minutes later, looking worried. Sarah had already left for work, so Thomas led his friend to the backyard patio where they could talk privately. The morning air was crisp, and the neighbor's cat watched them curiously from the fence. I think Sarah's planning something, Thomas said, his voice low despite them being alone. He recounted the conversation he'd overheard, watching Michael's expression change from concern to disbelief. Are you sure you're not jumping to conclusions? Michael asked, running a hand through his graying hair. This is Sarah we're talking about, the same Sarah who nursed you back to health when you had that terrible flu last year. The same Sarah who surprised you with a vintage guitar for your birthday because she remembered you talking about it once. Thomas paced the patio, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee mug. I know how it sounds, but you didn't hear her, Mike. The secrecy, the timing with my fishing trip, it's all too perfect. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying his friend's face. So what exactly are you planning to do? Thomas took a deep breath. I'm going to disappear during my fishing trip. Make it look like an accident. Then we'll see how Sarah reacts, what she does, who she contacts, whether she tries to access any hidden accounts. That's insane, Michael protested, standing up. You can't fake your own death. It's probably illegal, and definitely cruel. I'm not asking for your permission, Thomas said firmly. I'm asking for your help. I need someone on the outside who can watch Sarah and report back to me. I'll stay at that old cabin your family owns up north, the one you never use anymore. Michael paced the patio, clearly conflicted. This is going to blow up in your face, Tom. And when it does, I don't want any part of it. Please, Mike, Thomas pleaded. You're the only one I can trust. If I'm wrong about everything, I'll admit it and face the consequences. But if I'm right, if Sarah is planning something, I need to know. For several long moments, Michael said nothing. The neighbor's cat had lost interest and wandered away. Finally, Michael sighed heavily. The cabin key is in the usual hiding spot. I'll check on Sarah every day and let you know what's happening. But I'm telling you right now, this is a terrible idea. Thomas spent the next 2 days preparing. He arranged for his boat to be found drifting empty on the lake. He packed a small bag with essentials and hid it in his car. He made sure his life insurance policy was current, something that now seemed more important than ever. The hardest part was acting normal around Sarah. Every time she smiled at him or asked about his day, he felt a stab of guilt mixed with suspicion. Was she really concerned about his upcoming fishing trip, or was she counting down the hours until whatever she had planned? On Wednesday night, the evening before his departure, Sarah made his favorite dinner, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables. As they ate, she reached across the table and took his hand. Please be careful tomorrow, she said, her brown eyes filled with what looked like genuine concern. I always worry when you go out on that lake alone. Thomas squeezed her hand, forcing a smile. I'll be fine. I promise. Later that night, as he packed his fishing gear in the garage, Thomas wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. But then he remembered Sarah's whispered phone conversation, and his resolve hardened. Tomorrow, Thomas Bennett would disappear, and the truth, whatever it was, would finally come out. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy fog hanging over the lake, perfect conditions for Thomas's plan. He kissed Sarah goodbye at 5:30 a.m., trying to memorize her face in case he was wrong about everything. She handed him a thermos of coffee and a packed lunch, just as she had done for every fishing trip over the past 15 years. I love you, she said, hugging him tightly. Call me when you get to your usual spot. Thomas nodded, knowing this would be the last call she would receive from him for a while. He drove to the lake, his stomach in knots. The parking lot was empty except for a few early morning fishermen loading their boats. Following his carefully crafted plan, Thomas launched his boat and headed out to his regular fishing spot. He made the promised call to Sarah, then waited an hour before putting his plan into action. He took off his life jacket and placed it carefully in the boat, making sure it looked like it had slipped off during an accident. He scattered some of his fishing gear around the deck, creating a scene of struggle. The small waterproof bag he had prepared was waiting under his seat. Thomas started the boat's motor and pointed it toward the center of the lake. Then, while the boat was moving slowly, he slipped quietly into the cold water on the opposite side, The fog provided perfect cover as he swam toward the secluded cove where he had hidden a second set of clothes and his car keys the day before. By the time he reached the shore, Thomas was shivering but determined. He quickly changed into dry clothes and made his way through the woods to where he had parked his second car, an old Honda he had bought with cash 2 days earlier. From there, he drove to Michael's family cabin, taking back roads to avoid being seen. Meanwhile, his empty boat would drift until someone noticed it. The Coast Guard would be called. They would find his phone, his wallet, and his fishing gear scattered across the deck. A search would begin, but they wouldn't find him. Thomas arrived at the cabin just as his phone started ringing, not his regular phone, which was still on the boat, but a prepaid phone he had bought specifically for communicating with Michael. His friend's message was brief. They found the boat. Sarah's been notified. Search and rescue is on their way. From the cabin's window, Thomas watched as helicopters began circling over the lake in the distance. He thought about Sarah receiving the news, imagining different scenarios. Would she break down in genuine grief, or would she immediately start making calls about the inheritance she had discussed in that mysterious phone conversation? As the day progressed, Michael kept sending updates. Sarah had rushed to the lake, hysterical. She was talking to the Coast Guard, providing them with photos and information. She had called Thomas's parents, who were now driving in from 3 states away. Thomas sat in the dimly lit cabin, trying to ignore the guilt gnawing at his conscience. He watched the local news on his laptop, seeing his own face appear on screen as reporters covered the story of his disappearance. A headline read, "Local software developer missing after fishing accident." By nightfall, the search had been scaled back due to darkness. Michael's last message of the day included a photo he had taken discreetly at the lake. It showed Sarah sitting alone on a bench near the water, her face in her hands. She was still wearing her work clothes, having rushed to the lake as soon as she got the call. Thomas stared at the photo for a long time. Was this the reaction of a guilty woman who had been planning something sinister? Or was he watching his wife's heart break because of his own paranoid suspicions? As he lay on the cabin's old couch that night, listening to the wind in the trees, Thomas wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The plan was in motion, and somewhere in the next few days, he told himself, the truth would finally come out. He just hoped he would be able to live with whatever that truth turned out to be. The next 3 days at Michael's cabin were the longest of Thomas's life. He spent hours watching news coverage of his own disappearance on his laptop and reading local social media posts about the search efforts. His face was everywhere, along with heartbreaking pleas from Sarah asking anyone with information to come forward. Michael's reports came in regularly, each one making Thomas question his decisions more deeply. Sarah had taken leave from work and was spending every day at the lake, joining the volunteer search parties that combed the shoreline. She barely ate or slept, according to Michael, who was doing his best to support her while carrying the weight of Thomas's secret. "She's different," Michael texted on the 4th day. "I've never seen her like this. She sits for hours staring at the water, clutching that old sweater of yours she always used to steal." Thomas remembered the sweater, a worn-out blue cardigan Sarah claimed was the most comfortable thing she'd ever worn. He pretended to be annoyed when she took it, but secretly loved seeing her wrapped up in it on cold mornings. The search efforts were beginning to wind down. The Coast Guard had covered every inch of the lake multiple times. Local dive teams had searched the deeper areas. Everyone was coming to the conclusion that Thomas Bennett was gone. On the 5th day, Thomas watched a news conference where the search coordinator announced they were transitioning from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The camera panned to Sarah in the crowd, supported by Thomas's parents on either side. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Thomas's mother held her close as she struggled to maintain her composure. "Your parents are a mess," Michael reported later that day. "Your dad hasn't said more than 2 words since they arrived. And your mom keeps going through old photo albums with Sarah, telling stories about when you were a kid." That evening, Michael sent another message that hit Thomas hard. "Sarah spent 3 hours at the church today. Found her sitting alone in the last pew, just staring at the altar. Remember how you two got married there? She was wearing her wedding ring on a chain around her neck." Thomas remembered their wedding day perfectly. Sarah had been radiant, practically floating down the aisle. They'd written their own vows, and Sarah had made everyone laugh by promising to always let Thomas control the TV remote, a promise she had broken approximately 2 days into their marriage. The sixth day brought unexpected news. Sarah had announced she was setting up a scholarship fund in Thomas's name at the local community college, where he sometimes taught programming classes in the evenings. She was using her own savings to establish it, wanting to help young people who shared Thomas's passion for technology. And here's the weird part, Michael wrote. She hasn't checked any of your accounts or talked to any lawyers. She's not even thinking about the insurance company yet. Your sister-in-law tried to bring it up, but Sarah shut her down. Said she couldn't think about that stuff right now. Thomas sat in the cabin's old rocking chair, reading Michael's message over and over. If Sarah had been planning something sinister, wouldn't she be moving quickly to access his accounts? Wouldn't she be talking to lawyers and insurance companies? Instead, she was setting up a scholarship with her own money. That night, Thomas barely slept. He kept seeing Sarah's face from the news conference, hearing about her sitting alone in their church. The woman he was watching didn't seem like someone with secret plans or hidden motives. She seemed like someone whose world had shattered. As dawn broke on the seventh day, Thomas heard his prepaid phone ping with another message from Michael. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, remembering the mysterious phone call that had started all of this. What he read made his blood run cold. "You need to know something," Michael's message read. "I just overheard Sarah talking to her sister about an inheritance. But it's not what you think. Not even close. Call me as soon as you can. This has gone far enough." Thomas stared at the message for a long time, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the cabin's dusty windows. Whatever truth he was about to discover, he had a feeling it would change everything. Thomas's hands trembled as he dialed Michael's number. He had moved away from the cabin's windows, sitting in the darkest corner as if someone might spot him through the thick forest surrounding the property. "You better be sitting down for this," Michael said when he answered. "I was at your house earlier, bringing Sarah some groceries because she hasn't been shopping. She was in the kitchen with her sister Claire, and I overheard everything." Thomas held his breath, waiting for the revelation that would either justify or condemn his actions. "The inheritance they were talking about," Michael continued, his voice heavy with meaning. "It's from their Aunt Eleanor. She's dying, Tom. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. That phone call you overheard? Sarah was talking to Claire about getting hospice care set up for their aunt." The phone nearly slipped from Thomas's grasp. Aunt Eleanor, the woman who had raised Sarah and Claire after their parents died in a car accident when Sarah was just 12. The same aunt who had helped pay for their wedding, who sent them a card every anniversary without fail. The meeting on Thursday, Michael explained, was with the hospice care team. Sarah and Claire were rushing to get everything arranged because Eleanor took a turn for the worse. The paperwork they needed to finalize. It was for medical power of attorney. Eleanor wanted to split everything between the sisters, but Sarah's been too devastated by your disappearance to even discuss it. Thomas sank to the cabin's floor, his legs no longer able to support him. The pieces were falling into place, but not in the way he had imagined. "There's more," Michael said. "Eleanor's been asking for you. She keeps telling Sarah how much she wishes she could see you one last time, tell you thank you for making her niece so happy. Sarah breaks down every time she visits because she has to tell her aunt that you're gone." Memories flooded Thomas's mind. Eleanor at their dinner table every Sunday, bringing her famous apple pie. Eleanor teaching him how to garden because Sarah had always wanted a vegetable patch but had a notorious black thumb. Eleanor beaming with pride when they named their first plant after her, a stubborn tomato plant that survived against all odds. The accounts Sarah mentioned in that phone call, Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. They were Eleanor's medical bills. She and Claire were trying to figure out how to handle the expenses without dipping into their aunt's savings. Eleanor wanted to leave them something to remember her by. Thomas could barely breathe. The weight of what he had done, the pain he had caused based on a misunderstood conversation, was crushing him. "Sarah's been spending her evenings sorting through old photo albums," Michael said. "Not just because she misses you, but because Eleanor asked for photos of all of them together. She wants to make sure Sarah and Claire have good memories to hold on to." Through the cabin's window, Thomas could see the sun setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. How many sunsets had Eleanor watched from her hospital bed, knowing they were numbered? How many times had Sarah driven to the hospital, carrying the weight of 2 devastating losses? "I had to tell you," Michael finished. "Because while you're hiding out here, thinking you're uncovering some kind of plot, Your wife is trying to say goodbye to the only mother figure she's ever known, and she's having to do it alone." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas thought about Sarah sitting in their church, wearing his wedding ring around her neck. He thought about her setting up the scholarship fund, about her searching the late day after day. He thought about Eleanor, who had welcomed him into their family without hesitation, who was now hoping to see him one last time, a wish that would go unfulfilled because of his paranoid suspicions. "What have I done?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Michael. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Michael replied quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" The weight of guilt pressed down on Thomas like a physical force as he paced the cabin floor. The truth about Aunt Eleanor had shaken him to his core, turning his suspicions into ashes in his mouth. Every passing hour felt like torture as he thought about Sarah dealing with both his disappearance and her aunt's terminal illness. Michael arrived at the cabin that evening, bringing food that Thomas barely touched. The two men sat in silence for a long time, the only sound coming from the old ceiling fan spinning lazily above them. "Eleanor's doctors say she probably has less than 2 weeks," Michael finally said, watching his friend's face crumple with shame. "Sarah visits her every evening after spending the day at the lake looking for you. She reads to her, shows her photos, tells her stories about you, trying to keep both of your memories alive at once." Thomas buried his face in his hands. "I've ruined everything, haven't I? How could I have been so stupid?" "The search teams are giving up," Michael continued. "They're planning to hold a memorial service next week. Sarah's been trying to postpone it, saying she's not ready to accept that you're gone. The irony is killing me, Tom." Through the cabin's window, they could see the moon rising over the trees. Thomas thought about all the nights he and Sarah had spent stargazing on their back porch, often joined by Aunt Eleanor, who knew all the constellations and their stories. "Eleanor told Sarah something yesterday," Michael said softly. "She said that even though you're gone, she's grateful that Sarah had 10 beautiful years of marriage with you." 15, Thomas corrected automatically, his voice breaking. "We were married for 15 years. "That's just it," Michael replied. "Eleanor's memory is starting to fade. She's getting confused about times and dates. Sometimes she thinks Sarah's parents are still alive. The doctors say it's part of the progression." Thomas stood up abruptly, walking to the window. His reflection stared back at him, showing a man he hardly recognized, unshaven, eyes haunted, shoulders bent with guilt. "Sarah's trying so hard to be strong," Michael continued. "She's handling the hospice arrangements, organizing Eleanor's medications, all while still believing she lost you. Yesterday, she found your old toolbox in the garage and just sat there holding your work gloves, crying. Claire found her there an hour later." Each word was like a knife in Thomas's heart. He remembered how Sarah used to tease him about those work gloves, saying they made him look like a proper handyman even though he could barely change a light bulb without her help. "And you know what's really getting to me?" Michael added, his voice growing angry for the first time. "Eleanor keeps asking Sarah that she's eating properly, if she's taking care of herself. Even while dying, she's worried about Sarah's well-being. Meanwhile, you're up here, hiding from imaginary problems." Thomas turned from the window, his decision finally crystallizing. "I need to go back." "It's not that simple anymore," Michael warned. "You can't just walk back into their lives like nothing happened. You let everyone believe you were dead. There will be consequences." "I know," Thomas said quietly, "but I have to try. Eleanor deserves to see me one last time. And Sarah." His voice caught. "Sarah deserves the truth, no matter what happens after." Michael studied his friend's face for a long moment. "If you're going to do this, you need to do it right. No more schemes, no more hiding. Just the truth, as painful as it might be." Thomas nodded, already dreading the conversations ahead. How would he explain his actions to Sarah? How could he face Eleanor, knowing he had wasted precious days they could have had together? The path ahead seemed impossible, but staying hidden was no longer an option. As midnight approached, Thomas began packing his few belongings, his mind racing with possible ways to return. One thing was certain, he had to act quickly. Eleanor's time was running out, and Sarah had already spent too many days carrying a burden she never should have had to bear. "Tomorrow," he said firmly, more to himself than to Michael. "Tomorrow, I face what I've done." The morning sun had barely risen when Thomas and Michael finalized their plan for his return. They decided that Thomas would first go to the hospital to see Eleanor, knowing that Sarah always visited in the evenings after spending her days at the lake. Thomas showered and shaved, trying to make himself look presentable. His hands shook as he buttoned a clean shirt Michael had brought him. The drive to the hospital felt surreal, with Thomas slumped down in the passenger seat to avoid being recognized. "Eleanor's in room 415, Michael said as they parked. "The nurses change shifts at 7, so this is our best chance to get you in without too many questions." The hospital corridors were quiet, with only the occasional nurse walking past. Thomas's heart pounded as they approached room 415. Michael checked inside first, then nodded. "She's awake." Thomas stepped into the room and felt his breath catch. Eleanor lay in the hospital bed, looking so much smaller and frailer than he remembered. Her gray hair was thin, her face pale, but her eyes, those kind eyes that had always sparkled with wisdom and humor, lit up when she saw him. "Thomas," she whispered, then smiled. "Oh, I knew you weren't gone. I kept telling Sarah, but she said I was just confused." Tears rolled down Thomas's cheeks as he approached her bed. "I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I'm so sorry." "Come here, dear boy," she said, patting the chair beside her bed. Her hand felt like paper when she reached for his. "You look troubled." Through his tears, Thomas explained everything: the misunderstood phone call, his paranoid suspicions, the fake accident. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression shifting between surprise, understanding, and sadness. "Oh, Thomas," she sighed when he finished. "Love makes fools of us all sometimes. But Sarah, my sweet, strong Sarah, she's been through so much." "I know," Thomas choked out. "I didn't know about your illness. I've wasted so much precious time." Eleanor squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Time is never wasted when it teaches us what matters most. But now you have to face what you've done, and that won't be easy." They talked for almost an hour, Eleanor's voice growing weaker but her mind remarkably clear. She told him about Sarah's daily visits, about how her niece tried to be strong but would sometimes break down when she thought Eleanor was sleeping. "She loves you so much," Eleanor said softly. "That's why this will hurt her deeply. But love can heal even the deepest wounds, if we're brave enough to face our mistakes." Around 8 o'clock, Michael urgently stuck his head in the door. "Sarah's here early. She's in the parking lot." Thomas's heart nearly stopped. Eleanor gripped his hand one last time. "Go through the back stairs." "But Thomas?" "Come back soon with Sarah. I don't have much time left, and I'd like to see you both together once more." Thomas bent down and kissed Eleanor's forehead, his tears falling onto her pillow. "I promise," he whispered. He and Michael barely made it to the stairwell before they heard Sarah's voice in the hallway, talking to a nurse. Through the small window in the door, Thomas caught a glimpse of his wife. Her hair pulled back messily, wearing his old college sweatshirt, carrying a small bouquet of the wildflowers Eleanor loved. "Now what?" Michael asked as they hurried down the stairs. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Now I go home. I'll wait for her there. It's time to stop running and face what I've done." They drove back in silence, the weight of what was to come hanging heavy between them. When they reached Thomas and Sarah's house, Michael handed him the spare key. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Want me to stay?" Thomas shook his head. "No, this is something I have to do alone. Sarah deserves that much." As Michael drove away, Thomas stood looking at his home, the home he'd shared with Sarah for 15 years. The porch swing where they spent summer evenings. The garden Eleanor had helped them plant. The life he'd nearly thrown away because of a misunderstanding. Taking a deep breath, he walked up the familiar path and unlocked the door. Now came the hardest part: waiting for Sarah to return and facing the consequences of his actions. Thomas sat in their living room for 3 hours, surrounded by the life he and Sarah had built together. Every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture they'd chosen together, reminded him of what he had nearly destroyed. He noticed small changes. Sarah had placed his favorite coffee mug on the mantel, along with his wedding ring, creating a sort of memorial. Around noon, he heard a car pull into the driveway. His heart stopped when he recognized the sound of Sarah's keys in the door. She stepped inside, still wearing his old college sweatshirt, her face pale and tired. When she saw him sitting there, she froze. The bag she was carrying fell to the floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. "Sarah," Thomas began, his voice breaking. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. Instead, she walked slowly toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. When she reached him, she touched his cheek with trembling fingers, as if making sure he was real. Then she slapped him. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Thomas didn't move, didn't try to defend himself. He deserved that and more. "I saw you at the hospital," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Through the stairwell window. I thought I was finally losing my mind with grief. But then I saw Michael's car, and suddenly everything made sense." Thomas looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "I heard you on the phone that night, talking about inheritance and paperwork. I thought." "You thought what?" Sarah's voice cracked. "That after 15 years of marriage, I was plotting against you, while I was actually trying to arrange hospice care for the woman who raised me." She sank into the chair across from him, looking exhausted. "Do you know what these past days have been like? Searching for you at the lake, planning your memorial, trying to be strong for Eleanor while watching her slip away." "I saw Eleanor this morning," Thomas said quietly. "She knew I wasn't dead. She kept telling you, but you thought she was confused." Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "She's dying, Thomas. She's dying, and I've been trying to handle everything alone, and you were hiding in Michael's cabin because you didn't trust me enough to just ask me about a phone call." Thomas moved to kneel in front of her, not daring to touch her but needing to be closer. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. What I did was unforgivable. I let my imagination run wild instead of talking to you. I caused you so much pain, and I can never take that back." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of hurt and anger, but also something else: exhaustion, relief, and perhaps a tiny spark of love that hadn't quite died. "Eleanor wants to see us together," Thomas said softly. "She doesn't have much time left, and she asked it." "Don't," Sarah interrupted. "Don't use her illness to try to fix this. We have so much to work through, Thomas, so much trust to rebuild, if that's even possible." She stood up, wiping her eyes. "I'm going back to the hospital. Eleanor needs me. As for us," she took a shaky breath, "I need time. I need to process this. And you need to tell everyone else the truth. Our parents, our friends, the police, everyone who's been searching for you, grieving for you." Thomas nodded, accepting her terms. "I'll do whatever you ask. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, to earn back your trust." Sarah walked to the door, then paused. "I never stopped loving you, Thomas. Even when I thought you were dead, I loved you. That's what makes this betrayal hurt so much." After she left, Thomas sat alone in their living room, surrounded by the pieces of their broken trust. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be anger, tears, and painful conversations. Their friends and family would be hurt and confused. Legal consequences might follow. But as he looked at their wedding photo on the wall, he made a silent promise to both Sarah and himself. If she gave him the chance, he would spend the rest of his life proving that love and trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, and with more strength than before. The end wasn't guaranteed, but the next chapter of their story was about to begin.